Welcome back. I'm Kimberly and this is Floral Art Review. And before we start, I will apologise for my voice. It is basically hay fever. It's springtime here in Australia as I record this video, and this is an occupational hazard for me, but I will persevere and hopefully it won't be too hard for you to listen to in terms of what we're talking about with this design today. So our review today is a class title of Southern Heat. It was an online competition, and so it was judged from the image of the design. And I've talked in other videos about getting the image right. And I think the first thing for me when I look at it now is that the image is too dark. I haven't used the background well enough to highlight the design, because part of the design is black and I've used a black background. And the base is black and you can hardly see the base of the design. So first things first, and if you're a member of our Floral Art online group, you'll get a monthly newsletter. And actually, having looked at this review, I've decided that this month's newsletter is going to talk about taking photographs for online competitions. And I might well do another video, but all of that aside, let's get back to talking about this particular design. So as I said, the title was Southern Heat. We had 70 centimetres of width and the height was unlimited. It was judged from the image, from an image taken from the front of the design. So if you're looking at online competitions, it will often tell you where to take the image from. And as I look at it now, I'm still happy with it as a design, but I can see where it needs a little bit more to fill out the design itself, because in essence, the plant material is not really dominating the design. It's certainly dominating it visually, but in volume-wise, there's not enough plant material in it, which is my first concern. But we will see what our AI DesignEye has got to say about the design. The structure of it is a timber base, painted black, and onto that I've placed the metal base that is the candelabra. So this is a 4-arm candelabra, and I have covered the 2 outside arms with red wool and the 2 inside arms with a textured black wool, and then through that structure I have put some decorative wire mesh that I've painted in blacks and reds, and there was supposed to be a little bit of gold there as well, because the idea was that was the flame that was around this flame. So my interpretation of Southern Heat was not about temperature in terms of climate, but more about food. And so that's why I've used chilies as the plant material in it. So we've got the chilies placed in the candle cups and then randomly through the mesh as well, to give the idea of that continuous flame. So it was the southern heat because I was in the southern hemisphere, and this was the heat that I was trying to depict through my plant material. The design didn't place in the competition, and I guess I wasn't all that disappointed, because I think I felt at the time that I didn't have enough plant material in it, but I didn't really know what else to add that wouldn't detract from that very stark interpretation of the class title. So hopefully we'll get some suggestions along the way. Let's see what our DesignEye has got to say about this design. An overall impression first. This contemporary design makes strong use of non-traditional materials such as red chili peppers, red wool, fibre wrapping, metallic mesh and textured black materials. The palette is tightly controlled, limited to bold red and black, and creating a dramatic and high impact visual experience. So that's exactly what I wanted, and it delivers in that sense, but it doesn't deliver in terms of the overall principles and elements of design, and including that predominance of plant material. Let's look now individually at the principles and elements of design and see what I could do to improve it. Line, first of all. Line is the dominant feature, which is pretty obvious. The vertical red lines created by the curved supports are powerful and stylized, immediately drawing the eye upward. The contrast between sinuous red lines and the linear mesh grid provide rhythmic variation, which is good, because I think that's what I was trying to achieve in having all of the chilies and those lines face one way, and the mesh sort of cuts that and brings your eye back into the design. So the suggestion here is the repetition of curves could be enhanced further by gently echoing them in the mesh form, softening the angularity without losing the impact. So what it's saying is that if I had made the mesh a little bit more sympathetic to the curves that are already dominant in those lines, that it would have helped the design more, and I can see that that is the case. Colour. The high contrast palette of red and black is visually arresting and evocative of heat, danger or intensity, making it well aligned with the title. The red is used in monochromatic saturation, creating unity and strength. So that means that I haven't varied the red colour at all. Everything that's red is the same red colour. So the suggestion is that slight tonal variation in the red, e.g. introducing a deeper maroon or a vermilion, could offer more depth while retaining the heat theme. And I think that's very true. I think there's not enough variation in that colour. It almost makes it flat in terms of the colour interpretation. There's no implied depth. You know, if I had even the mesh a different red to the chili red, or a couple of the chilies a deeper red, it would still have given me that sense of the heat, but it would have given it a little bit more interest, a visual interest, because of the colour variation. So texture. There is excellent textural contrast between the shiny peppers, fibrous wool and matte mesh. The use of visual and tactile texture keeps the eye moving despite the narrow colour range. So, you know, the balance is there visually in terms of there's texture that makes it different, even though the colour is not different enough. So the suggestion here is consider repeating the fine mesh texture in a secondary material, finer threads or transparent elements to improve cohesion. And that's a really interesting suggestion, because if I had looked at another plant material, so maybe coconut fibre, that I had coloured a little bit so that, you know, because we don't want it to be the brown colour, but if I had done that in the deeper red, it introduces a finer mesh. It's plant material, and it fits in with the thing because I could mould it to shapes. So an interesting suggestion that might have helped me, particularly because, as you know, texture is my favourite part of the principles and elements of design, and so that's something that I would definitely explore a little bit further and play with. Space. The design uses negative space effectively between elements, allowing light to pass through the mesh and giving the composition dimensionality. The three-dimensional depth helps the linear elements read as sculpture rather than flat design. So this was a problem where I remember when I was doing the design, was that because the candelabra was a very flat presentation, I needed something to give me depth in the design, particularly when you're doing it with an image. We need it to be clear that there is depth in the design, and so that's why I introduced the mesh, because that could give me the depth of the design, because I could have it the opposite way to the way the candelabra is. So the suggestion here is that the lower third could use slightly more air or light or smaller elements to create stronger balance through the form. So where I've got the lowest part of the chilies, which you can't really see all that well against the black parts of the candelabra, there needed to be a little bit more down there, or a little bit more, as it says, light or smaller elements. And I think that not only is that an issue with the space in the design, but I think it's also going to be an issue in terms of balance of the design. As it says, it creates a stronger balance through the form. So let's move on to form and see what else I could do. Balance will come after that. So form, first of all, the work is sculptural with good visibility of form from the front and likely side views. The mesh netting creates internal volume and adds interest without overwhelming the structure, which is, as I said, is exactly what I wanted. I wanted that depth in the design using the mesh. So the suggestion here is that experiment with slight angular shifts in the vertical lines to introduce dynamic asymmetry while keeping balance. So obviously, because the candelabra was a static form, I couldn't change that. But what I could do is slightly angle the placement. So where I've got it parallel to where I'm taking the photograph, if I had angled it even 5 or 10 degrees, it's going to give me a different look to the design. I can still see both sides of the design. The depth would be enhanced, and it gives me that added interest without changing the basic form of the design. So let's now look at balance. This is a visually balanced design with the tallest red element offset by other tall structures and curved lower supports. Despite asymmetry in individual elements, the design achieves asymmetrical balance through rhythm and repetition. So what it's saying there is that the design is visually balanced because there's enough repetition of the forms to create it. Otherwise, if I had maybe if I'd introduced some green chilies or some orange or some another colour, it wouldn't look as balanced because the repetition would not be there. So the suggestion here is, if viewed from other angles, ensure physical stability is not compromised by the top-heavy appearance. And so, as I was just saying before about the form, if I slightly angled this design on the bench to get a different angle for the photograph, I would have to ensure that it didn't, that the lower elements that are placed in that design, so the chilies that are in the bottom of the mesh, were still visible both sides of the design, so that we weren't drawn to the top and then looked like we were heading out backwards out of the design. So the balance was thrown across the design that way. So rhythm. Strong rhythmic flow is established by a repetition of curves, peppers, and the mesh patterns. There's a lively pulse that moves the eye from the bottom to the top along the dynamic red lines. So it is visually impactful, and you do feel like you've got to move through the design. I would like, the more I look at it, I would like to have had those chilies that are in the mesh facing the same way as the dominant chilies that are in the candelabra. But maybe that's not a good thing either. That might have made it look too static, and that, if you think about flames, which is what I was trying to represent, the flames go in all different directions. So maybe I'll leave it as it is. The suggestion here is adding a contrasting slow rhythm. A single sweeping arc might help calm the overall intensity slightly. I don't know how I would introduce that, because a sweeping arc, unless I just think it would ruin the line of the design. So I'd have to really play with that to see whether it would help the design, and how I could introduce it and what I could use to introduce it. Because as I look at it, I'm thinking about some sort of flexible foliage grass type arrangement, but I can't see how that wouldn't create either a frame for the design, which I didn't want, or would detract from the line that is so dominant and works so well in terms of the interpretation of the class title. So that one's one I'd have to play with. Probably wouldn't be the first one I'd try. The dominance now. Clear dominance of the red peppers and curved lines immediately grabs the attention. The black textural base provides strong support without competing visually. So that's true. I just think that I haven't incorporated the red enough through the whole of the design. So the bottom half now looks a bit more empty than it should. If we think about the flames, if I'd had sort of rows of chili coming up at different heights across that base, I think it would have helped the design as well. So the suggestion here is the red mesh could serve a stronger secondary role if given more deliberate shaping or placement. For example, echoing the flame patterns. So perhaps the answer would be to have another piece of the mesh across the bottom that was shaped in a different way. So it came out to the left rather than to the right of the design as you look at it. And that way it would give the flame, we'll repeat the flame idea. I could have more chilies in there, and it would give the base more, would make the base be more part of the design. So contrast. High contrast in colour, texture and shape is one of the strongest aspects of this design. The interplay between matte and glossy, rigid and fluid, sharp and soft adds intrigue. So in terms of contrast, that's a good result to have. The suggestion here is avoid over polishing all surfaces. Having some matte red could deepen the sensory contrast. So unfortunately the chilies were quite shiny. I didn't shine them deliberately. But what that has picked up in terms of the photograph is that how careful you have to be when you're taking a photograph of your design, that what you see in life is not always what's reflected in the photograph. So you need to take a lot of photographs and look at them and make sure that you pick the one that shows the design off to the best of its ability in terms of interpreting the class title. So here the light has caught those chilies and made them much more shiny than they actually were when I was looking at them. And what it's also done is picked up the gold parts of the mesh that were unpainted and made them shiny as well. So there's just a bit too much shine in the design in terms of contrast. So unity, excellent unity in terms of colour and theme. All elements relate to the concept of southern heat, either directly, the chili shapes, or metaphorically, red for warmth and black for charcoal. So the suggestion here is that greater unity could be achieved by visually linking the black forms more closely to the red curves, perhaps via shared texture or overlap. So the indication here is that the arms of the candelabra that are covered with the black wool and the base are very separate to the rest of the design. There is a little bit of black on the mesh, but once again, the image doesn't show it clearly enough. And so perhaps introducing the black through some of those red lines would have helped the design, or even having at the top of the red arms, having the black wool before the red of the chili might have just changed the dynamic somewhat and given the overall appearance a little bit more unity. So finally, the overall impression of the design. Southern Heat is a bold, stylised, contemporary design with excellent control of materials and thematic expression. Its strongest qualities lie in colour dominance, rhythmic repetition and textural contrast. The design exudes intensity, movement and theatrical flair, well suited to competitive or gallery style display. So what it's saying there is that it interprets the theme well enough. There are things that could improve it, and I agree with that, and I certainly would look at some of those suggestions to increase the coherence, the unity of the design, to make it more impactful, and particularly in that bottom section, which the more I look at it, the more I feel is very blank. So there we have this week's interpretation from AI and the suggestions along the way. If you have a design that you would like assessed or analysed in this way, just follow the instructions on the website. For those of you who are looking at this time of year when it's recorded, so September and October in 2025, I will encourage you to have a look at our international online competition, which is going to be judged by our AI that's been trained for well over 12 months in looking at the principles and elements of design. You'll get feedback exactly like this from the competition, as well as from just uploading your images for a quick review. I will leave it there for this week so I can rest my voice for next week. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review.